Hey, welcome to our study, Connecting the Dots. Last week, we saw that God gave a prophecy to Daniel that spanned 70 weeks, or when we applied the formula to it, it was really 490 years because each week we saw was 7 years. And last time we were together, we looked at the first 69 weeks. And if you, by the way, if you haven't watched last week's study, I would suggest you watch that before continuing on with this one because it'll make a whole lot more sense if you watch last week's. But tonight we're going to look at that final week, the last 7 years of Daniel's prophecy. And there are still three items that haven't been accomplished in the prophecy yet. And you remember in verse 24, we laid out the purpose of the prophecy. This is what verse 24 said: 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. And then there are six things that are decreed. One is to finish the transgression. Two is to make an end of sin. And three is to make atonement for iniquity. And we saw that those were already accomplished at the death of the Messiah, but we still have three more things to go. So number four is to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Now, before we go into the 70 weeks, there's a couple of things that we need to understand. The focus of this 7-year period is for Israel, just as the focus for the first 483 years were also directed at Israel. Remember, I shared with you that Daniel was praying about the destiny of his people, which would be the nation of Israel, and his holy city, the city of Jerusalem. And God gave this entire prophecy directed toward those two things, the Jewish people and the city of Jerusalem. And so the first 69 weeks applies to that, but so does the 70th week, which tells us that that 7-year period of time is for the nation of Israel. The second thing that I want us to understand is that there's a gap of time between the 69th and the 70th week that Daniel did not see. Prophecy often, someone had described once prophecies being like mountain peaks. When you're standing at the top of a mountain and you're looking across a mountain range, you see the tops of the mountains, and it looks like one is right after the other. But if you were to walk out and journey across that mountain range, you would discover that between each of these peaks are huge valleys that you'd have to walk down through and then back up again. Well, when Daniel was looking out across time and he saw these 70 weeks, there was a gap of time between the 69th and the 70th week that Daniel didn't see. Now, the Apostle Paul sees it because he was the apostle who was given the mystery of the church, that God would deal with the Gentiles for a period of time, but his purposes for the nation of Israel were not yet finished. So from Daniel's perspective, it looked like 70 contiguous weeks, but our understanding is there's a gap of time between week 69 and week 70. In fact, you'll notice this even in the text, how the first 69 weeks are connected. In verses 25 through 27, it says, "So you are to know and to discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Notice it's 7 and 62. He connects those two together. And then down in verse 26, he says, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. So these weeks are all connected. Even in the language, he's using conjunctions. But when he gets to the final week, he doesn't connect it linguistically to the first 69. Down in verse 27, he says, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. So that's a clue again that these 69 weeks may be contiguous, but the 70th week is not. And then also the purpose of the 70 weeks is to bring Israel back to the Lord so that they recognize Jesus as their Messiah. The prophecy that the Apostle Paul gave in Romans chapter 11 must be fulfilled. And this 70th week is for the purpose of fulfilling that prophecy. And this is what it says. For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And thus all Israel will be saved. Just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So Paul is saying there will come a day when the nation of Israel will recognize that Jesus is their Messiah and they will turn to him. And Daniel's 70th week is going to be used by God to accomplish that purpose. Right now we're in that gap, and it's the church age. It's the age of the Gentiles. But someday that period of time is going to be fulfilled, and God is once again going to turn his attention to the Jews and bring them back to himself. Now, back to our prophecy. Daniel 9:26 says, "Then after 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood." So he's talking about the people of the prince. Now we know that the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so after the Messiah is cut off, after the crucifixion, the city is going to be destroyed, the sanctuary and the city. And we know historically this happened in 70 AD, and it happened by the Romans. They came in under Titus Vespasian, and they sacked the city. They tore down the temple. They did not leave one stone on another. That's why when you go to Jerusalem today, we see the Temple Mount, we see the wall and the foundation on which the temple sat, but the temple is gone. They completely tore it down. They killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. The whole incident at Masada took place, where they put a siege against Masada and stormed that city that was built on top of a mountain where Jews had escaped to try to hide from the Romans. And after a 2 or 3 year siege, they finally destroyed them. Well, the people actually committed suicide so that the Romans wouldn't take them. But they just completely devastated the Jewish people in 70 AD. So the prince, he says the prince of the people to come. So this isn't describing the prince himself, it's describing his people. If the prince were the one that was sacking Jerusalem, it would have just said that the prince did it. But it's saying that the people of the prince did it. All right. And so we know that the people were the Romans. And so we know that the prince that is to come is connected to Rome. And so after the destruction of the temple and the city in 70 AD, this prince who is to come, who's going to come out of Roman descent, is going to make a treaty with the nation of Israel. Now that's interesting, because in 135 AD, the nation of Israel was completely scattered from the land and stayed that way until 1948. So this could not be referring to Titus doing this. It has to be something that happens later. So verse 27 says, "And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week." All right, so that's the 70th week. He's going to make a firm covenant. He's going to make a peace treaty with the nation of Israel. He, by the way, is not referring to Jesus. He will make a firm covenant. It's referring to the Antichrist. And you'll notice here how Daniel uses the word prince twice. This person's called the prince of the people who will come. All right, so this prince who's to come, who's connected to Rome, is going to make a treaty. But he also talks in verse 25 about Messiah the prince. So you have the prince, Messiah, and then you have the people of the prince who's going to destroy the city. It's like Christ and Antichrist, prince and the prince. And we know that this prince in verse 26 and 27 is an enemy of God because he destroys the sanctuary. God actually describes, or Daniel describes this prince further on in Daniel 11:36. And we know this isn't Jesus because listen to how he's described. "Then the king will do as he pleases," right? "And he will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done." The indignation is that period of time when the wrath of God is being poured out on the world. And here he's called the king. All right, he ascends into power. He becomes literally the dictator of the entire world. The Apostle Paul mentioned him as well in 2 Thessalonians 2, 3, and 4. He says, "Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first." Talking about the day of the Lord. It will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. So this being is going to go into a temple, so the temple has to be rebuilt yet, and he's going to create the great sacrilege by placing himself in the temple and decreeing that he is God. Now, Jesus spoke of this very situation and referenced the prophecy of Daniel that we're studying right now. In Matthew 24:15, Jesus said, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand," standing in the sanctuary, in the temple. So the Antichrist is going to make a covenant with the nation of Israel. It'll be a 7-year covenant. It'll be broken at the middle of the tribulation, which means that before the middle of the tribulation, a temple will need to be built. It also means that there will be a revised Roman Empire, that there's going to be some coalition of nations that makes up the ancient territory of the Roman Empire, and out of that land mass, out of that region, the Antichrist will rise to power. And that empire, by the way, in the day of Rome, when they were in the days of Titus Vespasian, when the city was destroyed, their empire spread through the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. So that landmass, out of that landmass is going to arise this individual. So this is saying that Israel is going to come back into their land. They're going to rebuild their temple. There's going to be a treaty that will be made for 7 years, and it's going to be with the Antichrist. And in the middle of that 7 years, the Antichrist will break the treaty, will desecrate the temple, and will demand that the people of the world worship him. And then notice in verse 27, too, it speaks of a firm covenant with the many. So this covenant is not necessarily with the prince. You notice that there's going to be a covenant between Israel and the many. Now, the prince is involved in this, but the prince could be brokering a covenant with Israel and others. And it's interesting that many peace treaties with Israel and the Palestinians have been brokered, and usually over the years when they've been brokered, it's been with a third party. Usually it's an American president. And I'm not suggesting that America is involved, but it shows an existing pattern of others in the world trying to bring about a peace deal between Israel and her enemies, and in our day that would be the Palestinians. And so there's a desire, because Israel seems to be the center of a lot of chaos in the world, and so the whole world would like to see peace happen. Now, back in Daniel 9, chapter 9, verse 27, it says, "But in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate." So offerings, again, indicate that the temple will be in use at this time. This person will commit abomination. That's how we know that it's not Messiah the Prince. This will climax until his destruction, which happens at the end of the Great Tribulation, and then everlasting righteousness will come, as stated in verse 24. Because here's what verse 24 says: 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, and to make atonement for iniquity. Okay, that's the first coming of Jesus. Those things happened on the cross. But then the second coming of Jesus, which is going to be completed at the end of the 70th week, it says to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So at the point that Christ reigns on the earth for 1,000 years, so he's going to come back at the second coming, at the end of the 7-year tribulation, and he's going to reign on this earth for 1,000 years, which means that everlasting righteousness will be brought in. And so Satan will be thrown into the abyss for that 1,000-year period. Sin and the devil and his demons will be put away. Everlasting righteousness will come in. Vision and prophecy will be sealed up. There will be no need for it, because Christ will literally be reigning on the planet during that time. And here's a picture. I think sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 years. I found this chart. Some of the dates don't align exactly with the dates that I gave you, but that's okay. It still gives you a general understanding. You'll notice in this chart we have, it says in the very left column, lifetime of Daniel, who writes this prophecy, 550 BC. All right, you have the first 69 weeks, which is 483 biblical years. The decree to rebuild Jerusalem is fulfilled in 444. I told you 445, so you got a couple of different years variation there. And then you have the end of that 69 weeks. It says Messiah the Prince, which he has fulfilled in 33 AD. I said 31 AD, fulfilled in the lifetime of Jesus. Then there's this proposed time gap between the 69th week and the 70th week. And you'll see here that 6 things have to happen. First, the Messiah is to be cut off. He's going to be killed. Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed. That happened and then the continuation of the time gap. So you'll notice that the Messiah is cut off. That happened soon after the 69 weeks. That's when Jesus was crucified. Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed. That was fulfilled in 70 AD. And then the continuation of the time gap, and that's currently being fulfilled now. And then you have the 70th week, a covenant with Israel, and the abomination of the desolation at the midpoint by the prince who is to come. And that will be fulfilled at an unknown future date. We don't know when that 70th week will start in terms of a calendar date. We don't know when it's going to be. The rapture of the church, I believe, will happen before that 70th week begins. And there could be a gap of time between the rapture and when that 70th week begins. So there are a lot of unknowns there that we don't know. We just know that that 70th week will come and it will be fulfilled, and the rapture of the church will come and will be fulfilled. Both of those are in our future. We don't know exactly when they are. But all of that is predicting the scope of what God wants to do with the nation of Israel and how we fit into all of that. And so that connects the dots between Daniel, between Jesus, between the New Testament, and between our time. And so I thank you for joining me as we seek to connect the dots. Peace.